Before sunrise on April 12, 1861, Charleston Harbor held its breath. A single mortar shell arced out of the darkness from Fort Johnson burst over Fort Sumter and summoned a ring of Confederate batteries to life. For 34 hours, the sky flashed and thundered. By the afternoon of April 13th, Major Robert Anderson would accept evacuation terms, and the first battle of the American Civil War would be over. How did the nation arrive at this pre-dawn spark? 4 months earlier, South Carolina had become the first state to abandon the Union December 20, 1860, a secession rooted in the defense of slavery and in the shock of Abraham Lincoln's election. 6 days later, judging his seaside post at Fort Moultrie indefensible, Major Anderson ferried his 85-man garrison under cover of darkness to the unfinished brick stronghold that dominated the harbor's mouth, Fort Sumter. The stars and stripes went up at dawn, and with it, the stakes of national legitimacy. Charleston tested those stakes almost immediately. On January 9, 1861, Citadel cadets at Cummings Point fired on the unarmed relief steamer Star of the West, driving it back to sea, while Anderson, lacking timely orders, held his fire. The moment passed without open war, but the fuse burned on. Through the winter, secession spread and guns multiplied along the harbor. When Lincoln took office in March, Sumter had weeks of food left. He chose a narrow course, announced a limited resupply of subsistence and other supplies, while avoiding an aggressive reinforcement that might cast the Union as the provocateur. Charleston was formally notified that provisions would be sent. Confederate command at Charleston under Brig. General P.G.T. Beauregard, once Anderson's artillery pupil, could not allow a federal outpost to be sustained in the heart of seceded territory. He demanded surrender on April 10th. Anderson refused. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, Confederate guns opened the bombardment. Some 6,000 Confederates ringed the harbor with several dozen cannon and mortars. Inside Sumter, more than 4 dozen guns sat on the walls, but the undermanned garrison could serve only a few at a time. The exchange would level barracks, set timbers ablaze, and blast the fort's parade ground into craters, but kill no one in combat. The only fatalities came after the terms were agreed. During Anderson's 100-gun salute to the flag, a premature discharge detonated cartridges, killing Private Daniel Houff and mortally wounding another, an awful punctuation mark to the war's first encounter. Fort Sumter's fall electrified both sections. Within 48 hours, Lincoln called for 75,000 state militiamen to suppress the rebellion, a national mobilization that turned a harbor bombardment into a continental war. As winter deepened into the uncertain spring of 1861, the United States stood divided not just by lines on a map, but by fear, pride, and the momentum of history. The firing on Star of the West had already shown that diplomacy was dying, yet both North and South clung to the hope that war might somehow be avoided. Still, across Charleston Harbor, men labored day and night, digging mounting guns and stacking powder kegs. The uneasy calm before the storm was filled with the clang of hammers and the ring of iron. Major Robert Anderson, a professional soldier and a Kentuckian by birth, knew how fragile his position had become. His small garrison at Fort Sumter numbered fewer than 100 men, regular Army artillerists, engineers, and a few laborers. They had provisions for 6 weeks at most. Every day Anderson surveyed the Confederate works growing around him, sand batteries on Morris Island, heavy guns at Fort Johnson, and the looming casemates of Fort Moultrie now turned against him. The circle was closing. In the city beyond Charleston seethed with excitement and defiance. Secession banners fluttered from every window. Militia units drilled along the battery, their gray and butternut uniforms still bright and untested. To the citizens, Fort Sumter was not a military threat, but a symbol of foreign fortress occupying the sovereign soil of South Carolina. It had to fall. Meanwhile, in Washington, the newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible dilemma. To abandon Sumter meant acknowledging secession as a fact. To reinforce it meant firing the first shot. His cabinet split over the question. Secretary of State William H. Seward urged compromise, while Postmaster General Montgomery Blair argued that surrender would be national suicide. The decision came slowly, carefully. The fort would be provisioned, not reinforced. A single expedition under Captain Gustavus Fox would sail from New York carrying food and essentials, not troops. The message to Charleston was clear: the Union would not yield, but neither would it strike first. As the supply ships prepared to depart, Confederate forces in the South gathered strength. Beauregard, given command of Charleston's defenses, organized more than 6,000 men and over 50 guns around the harbor. Every position from Cummings Point to Sullivan's Island was linked, coordinated, and waiting for orders. By early April, the balance hung on a single question: would the Union ships arrive before Beauregard's patience ran out? The men in both camps knew the answer could decide the fate of the nation. Midnight, April 11th, 1861. The harbor was shrouded in mist, the tide whispering against the stones of Fort Sumter. From across the black water came the creak of oars and the soft flash of lantern light, a Confederate delegation, white flag raised. At their head was Colonel James Chestnut, aide to General Beauregard, bearing the general's final demand: the immediate surrender of the fort. Inside the dimly lit walls, Major Robert Anderson received them calmly. He was weary, his face drawn from sleepless nights and the weight of responsibility. His men, less than 100, were exhausted, their supplies almost gone. Yet surrender for Anderson was unthinkable without a fight. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "I shall await the first shot." The words fell like a verdict. The Confederate officers returned across the water. Beauregard had served once under Anderson at West Point, and the order that now lay before him, to open fire on his old instructor, seemed almost sacrilege. Yet the political tide had swept away friendship and hesitation alike. President Jefferson Davis, desperate to assert Confederate sovereignty before Lincoln's relief fleet could arrive, had already given the command: if Sumter is not surrendered, reduce it by force. At 3:20 a.m., April 12th, Beauregard sent a final message across the harbor: unless Anderson agreed to evacuate, the batteries would open fire in 1 hour. The reply came just before 4 a.m. Polite, brief, and final: Anderson would not yield. At 4:30 a.m., a single mortar shell arced from Fort Johnson and burst over Sumter, scattering sparks across the night sky. For an instant, the harbor fell silent, and then, as if the heavens themselves split, a thunderous barrage erupted from every Confederate battery. From Morris Island, Cummings Point, Fort Moultrie, and Sullivan's Island, over 4,000 shells began to rain upon Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Inside the fort, Anderson's men scrambled to their guns. The masonry shook with every impact, bricks showered down like hail. They fired back slowly, the garrison too few to man all the pieces, each shot swallowed by the roar of a dozen Confederate guns. The air filled with choking smoke and the bitter stench of gunpowder. The walls trembled, windows shattered, timbers splintered. Outside crowds gathered along Charleston's waterfront to watch history ignite. Every cannon flash lit the city's rooftops in crimson. On the parapets, soldiers cheered each Confederate volley as church bells tolled triumphantly. For 34 hours, the duel thundered across the harbor. The defenders held their ground through the day, through fire and collapse, until the barracks caught flame and ammunition threatened to explode. By April 13th, the flag of the United States hung torn and blackened, yet still flying. The moment of decision had come. The morning of April 13th in 1861 dawned through a haze of smoke and ash. For more than a day, Fort Sumter had endured the relentless pounding of Confederate artillery. The once proud walls were blackened and cratered, their parapets shattered the air thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and sulfur. Inside, Major Robert Anderson's men, weary, hungry, and deafened, continued the hopeless struggle. Every cannon recoil shook the fort like thunder rolling through stone. The Confederate batteries maintained their rhythm with brutal precision. From Fort Moultrie and Cummings Point, hot-shot iron balls, heated until they glowed red, rained upon the fort, igniting everything they touched. Soon, the wooden barracks inside Sumter caught fire. Flames spread across the parade ground, licking at the powder magazines. Smoke billowed up, blotting out the sun. Men coughed half-blind, stumbling through ash and embers as they tried to smother the blaze with soaked blankets. Outside, Charleston's harbor had become an inferno. Boats ferried fresh ammunition to the Confederate batteries, and the sound of cannon fire rolled endlessly, echoing against the water and the city's brick facades. Anderson's men could barely respond. Their limited powder had to be conserved. Many of their guns were disabled or buried under debris. Yet even as the flames devoured their barracks, they refused to strike the flag. Anderson gave the order to keep firing, not in hope of victory, but to show that the Union still stood. By noon, the situation was desperate. The fort's flagstaff, charred and weakened, suddenly broke under fire. For a moment, the flag vanished in smoke, and Charleston erupted in wild cheers, believing Sumter had fallen. But within minutes, Lieutenant Norman Hall and a handful of soldiers braved the firestorm, climbed the ramparts, and raised the flag again on a temporary pole. A cheer rose inside the fort, weary, defiant, and proud. Beauregard's observers, realizing the fort still resisted, renewed the bombardment. Shells exploded overhead, scattering fragments through the ruins. Yet even in defeat, Anderson's defense had become a symbol, a handful of men surrounded, holding out against an entire army, their courage echoing through the storm of gunfire. By late afternoon, Anderson knew further resistance was pointless. His supplies were gone, his men near collapse, and the flames now threatened the powder magazine. At 2:30 p.m., a white flag was raised from the ramparts. The guns fell silent for the first time in 34 hours. Fort Sumter had fallen, but without a single combat death. The cost would come later on 1,000 battlefields yet to be named. Afternoon light filtered weakly through the smoke as the guns fell silent. After 34 hours of bombardment, the walls of Fort Sumter stood in ruins, the air thick with heat and ash. The defenders, soot-streaked their uniforms, scorched and torn, moved among the wreckage with a dazed calm. They had done all they could. At around 2:30 p.m., April 13, 1861, Major Robert Anderson agreed to a formal truce with General Beauregard. The Confederates offered generous terms. Anderson and his men could evacuate honorably, carrying their personal arms, and most importantly, they would be permitted to salute the American flag before lowering it. Beauregard, once Anderson's pupil, insisted upon that courtesy. Even in victory, he understood the weight of the moment. This was not conquest, but the birth of a terrible war between brothers. The following morning, under a sullen, smoky sky, the Union garrison assembled in the courtyard. The flag, tattered, blackened, and holed by shells, still flew above the shattered ramparts. To the slow roll of drums, Anderson ordered a 100-gun salute to the Stars and Stripes before its final descent. The salute began in solemn rhythm, one thunderous report every few seconds. Onlookers along Charleston's harbor watched in respectful silence, the crack of each cannon echoing like a heartbeat of the dying Union. After the 50th round, tragedy struck. A spark ignited a pile of cartridges near the cannon's muzzle. The explosion hurled men to the ground. Private Daniel Hofe was killed instantly, and Private Edward Galloway mortally wounded, the first deaths of the American Civil War. The salute was cut short at 50 rounds. As the flag descended, Anderson held the halyard himself. The cloth that had flown through fire and smoke slipped slowly down the staff, folding against the ruin it had once commanded. Soldiers removed their caps. The guns were silent. Across the harbor, Confederate soldiers watched in stillness, many of them wordless faces darkened not by soot, but by realization. What had begun as a matter of pride had now drawn blood. The first war between Americans had truly begun. That afternoon, Anderson and his men boarded a ship bound for New York. As they sailed out of Charleston Harbor, they carried with them the tattered flag of Fort Sumter, a relic of defiance that would become a rallying symbol for the Union in the years to come. As the smoke of Fort Sumter drifted out over the Atlantic, the echo of its guns rolled across a nation that would never be the same again. Within 24 hours of the bombardment, news galloped north by telegraph and steam. The Union flag had fallen. In every city, men stopped in the streets to read the headlines, hearts torn between disbelief and fury. President Abraham Lincoln, calm but resolute, proclaimed a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Across the South, bells rang and flags unfurled. Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas, states that had hesitated, now chose the Confederacy. Richmond became its new capital. What had begun as a political crisis had exploded into a continental war. From New York to New Orleans, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, America divided itself with terrifying speed. Families were split. Brothers took opposite sides. Ministers blessed their congregations for battle. Train stations filled with recruits. Factories hammered out muskets and cannon, and newspapers predicted a short war. No one yet imagined that over 600,000 Americans would die before it was over. In the North, Anderson's defense of Sumter became legend. The tattered flag he carried from the fort was raised in Union rallies, its burned edges a badge of honor. It symbolized endurance, the belief that the Union, though battered, would not break. In the South, Sumter was celebrated as the birth cry of a new nation, proof that courage and conviction could stand against overwhelming odds. But beneath the cheers on both sides, a darker realization began to spread. The war that had started in Charleston Harbor would consume everything: cities, fields, fortunes, and generations. The first smoke of Sumter was only the dawn of a firestorm, and as the sun set over Charleston that April evening, the guns grew cold, but the silence they left behind was heavier than sound. The next battles, Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, were still only names on a map waiting to be written in blood. Fort Sumter had fallen, but its echo had awakened the giant. The United States of America had entered its greatest trial, a war that would decide not just who ruled, but what kind of nation would emerge from the ashes.